The soft hum of the Atlantic Blue 274's engines filled the cabin as Clara Whitman settled into seat 1A of the first-class section. Morning light spilled through the oval window beside her, painting the leather headrest in golden hues. She adjusted the thin gray cardigan draped over her shoulders, took a steadying breath, and laid her tablet and notes gently on the fold-out tray. At 14, Clara carried herself with a quiet confidence. No fidgeting, no nervous glances, just the poised calm of someone who'd practiced this moment 1,000 times. It was her first solo flight to Boston for the Federal Student Engineering Competition, and this seat wasn't mere luxury. It was a recognition of her work, a nod from her mother, FAA Administrator Dr. Elise Whitman. But Clara's loyalty to her own merit far outweighed any family connection. She wasn't here for privilege. She was here to represent the Youth Federal Evaluator Program, a pilot initiative that placed select teens aboard commercial flights to assess cabin safety and service from an unguarded perspective. Clara's assignment was exactly that: observe, document, remain undetected. She tapped her tablet, opening a bullet point list of cabin service checkpoints, cabin crew interaction standards, and emergency equipment protocols. She'd rehearsed this checklist dozens of times, never knowing which moment might reveal a procedural mistake or a lapse in crew courtesy. But for now, the cabin looked flawless. Polished overhead bins, crisp white linens on the center console, soft murmur of passengers boarding. A flight attendant passed by, nose to phone, scanning the aisle, until she paused at seat 1B. Clara's gaze lifted, curious. Enter Beverly Langdon. Her uniform, navy skirt, jacket sharply tailored, scarlet scarf knotted at the throat, spoke of strict professionalism. Her heels clicked down the aisle, a measured rhythm. Clara watched as Beverly's keen eyes swept over the cabin, then zeroed in on her. In that moment, the air shifted, as if the temperature in the cabin had dropped a degree. "Excuse me," Beverly said, her voice perfectly polite yet edged with steel. Clara looked up, offering a slight nod. Beverly leaned in, gaze flicking to Clara's tablet screen just long enough to catch the words FAA Youth Evaluator. Then she glanced at Clara's boarding pass, still tucked neatly into her passport wallet. "First class isn't for school projects, sweetheart," she continued, voice loud enough for the 3 seats on Clara's right to hear. "You'll need to move to the back while we sort this out." Time seemed to slow. The soft clink of a coffee cup somewhere behind Clara echoed louder than expected. A business traveler at 1C lowered her newspaper, eyebrows raised. A couple in 1D shifted in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. Clara bit her lip, heart thudding in her chest like a trapped bird. She knew the rules. Never argue, never accuse, never let them see you sweat. Deep in her pocket, her thumb brushed the smooth metal edge of her tablet's camera button. Still seated, Clara raised her hand, a small, controlled gesture that caught Beverly's attention. "I'm sorry," Clara said, her tone even, "but I have a confirmed first-class ticket booked under my name." She produced the boarding pass, opening it just enough for the barcode to glint in the overhead light. Beverly's eyes narrowed, but she didn't scan. Instead, she tucked her chin and spoke directly into the overhead speaker, her voice deliberate. "Cabin doors are closed in 10 minutes. Any seat disputes can be resolved at the gate agent's desk." She paused, then looked back down at Clara. "Until then, I suggest you comply." Clara swallowed. She closed her eyes briefly, envisioning her mother's calm authority, the way Dr. Whitman would handle any crisis on a flight path of legislation or procedure. Clara straightened, quietly extracted her boarding pass again. The barcode was crisp. Clara Whitman, 1A, Atlantic Blue 274. No errors, no voids. Around her, the cabin went still. Conversations hushed. A young man to her left lowered his headphones. The flight attendant assigned to that section hovered awkwardly by the curtain partition, uncertain whether to intervene. Clara felt the weight of every gaze, some sympathetic, others curious, many indifferent. She met Beverly's eyes again. No anger, no tears, just clarity. With a deliberate nod, Clara stood and slid her tablet into her bag. Her fingers lingered on the side of the bag, as if savoring its familiar warmth. Then she moved out of the first-class cabin, past the silent rows, toward the curtain that separated luxury from the rest of the plane. As she walked, memories flickered. Her first engineering fair, her mother's proud smile as she accepted that email confirming the evaluator program, the countless hours tracing airflow simulations on her bedroom floor. She wasn't just another passenger. She was a guardian of standards, invisible but vigilant. Reaching seat 29D, Clara paused. She pressed her palm to the seat back in front of her, feeling its leather texture. She slid into the seat, the narrow, dim aisle suddenly feeling like a stage. She exhaled slowly. In her mind, she tapped the FAA app icon, waiting. She wouldn't immediately call for help. She didn't need to. The program's protocol was simple. Observe, record, deliver data. 20 seconds ticked by. The flight attendant behind her adjusted a pillow at 29E. Passengers murmured about the delay, some sighing. Clara didn't flinch. Her thumbs hovered over her phone's screen. And then, almost before the murmurs grew louder, she typed, "Unverified removal, no scan, public humiliation, code 4A. She hit send. Back in Washington, D.C., secure servers lit up. Deep in the bowels of the FAA's monitoring network, red flags flashed next to Whitman 14A protocol. Within minutes, her silent report would trigger the most severe escalation. Clear deck protocol, immediate post-landing review, and a blacklist of the entire crew. But Clara didn't wait for the fallout. She closed her eyes, pressed her bag to her chest, and watched the soft glow of the cabin lights through her window, knowing that sometimes the quietest passenger holds the most power. Clara sat in silence as Beverly Langdon's footsteps receded toward the galley. The murmur of the cabin staff faded, replaced by a heavy hush that settled over the first-class section like dust. Around her, passengers shifted. Some glanced over with sympathetic eyes, others busied themselves with magazines or laptops, pretending nothing had happened. Clara watched them all, counting heartbeats, tracing the slow drip of humiliation. She reached into her pocket for the boarding pass, fingertips brushing the crisp edge of the paper. Her name, Clara Whitman, and her seat, 1A, glowed in indigo ink, stark against the muted gray of the document. No typo, no loophole, no excuse. Yet Beverly hadn't bothered to scan the barcode. She'd simply pronounced judgment and waved her hand as though swatting a stray fly. Clara closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, inhaled steadily, and forced herself to exhale with a quiet hiss. Not here, not now. The rules were clear. No outbursts, no confrontations, no matter how deep the wound. This wasn't her first rodeo with prejudice. She'd felt it in middle school classrooms and science fairs, but there, she had the luxury of a lecture hall or an auditorium to gather her bearings. Here, on a moving metal tube thousands of feet in the air, she had only the soft glow of cabin lights and the unblinking eyes of strangers. Still seated, she unfastened her seatbelt and rose to her feet. Her movements were deliberate, as if choreographed to a slow dance. She slid her tablet into her backpack, the smooth click of the zipper sounding louder than it should. The man in 1C looked up from his tablet, eyebrows arching in confusion. A woman in 1D frowned behind mirrored sunglasses, adjusting her pearl earrings. A little boy leaned forward from 1E, curious but polite. Clara paused at the threshold of the curtain dividing first class from economy. She straightened her back, shoulders squared, and brushed her fingertips against the velvet partition. For a moment, she considered ripping it open, challenging Beverly's presumption. But she didn't, because discretion was her weapon. With one fluid motion, she stepped through. The bright white upholstery of first class gave way to the deeper blues and grays of premium economy. The carpet underfoot felt coarser, the lighting slightly dimmer. She navigated the aisle, each footfall echoing softly against the hum of the engines. A flight attendant in a charcoal gray uniform caught her eye and offered a tentative nod. Clara gave a small, almost imperceptible smile in return. It wasn't gratitude, it was acknowledgement. They both knew the script. Passengers move to their assigned seats. Crew carries on. She reached row 29 and slid into seat D, a narrow space wedged between the fuselage wall and a young couple. The man shifted over to make room. The woman tucked her laptop under the seat in front of her. Clara sat down, pulled her backpack onto her lap, and ran her thumbs over the embossed leather front. She felt the reassuring heft of the device inside. Her tablet, her notebook, her shield. Around her, the cabin stirred back to life. A mother whispered to her toddler. A businessman clicked his tablet awake. The flight attendant behind Clara straightened her jacket and offered a polite smile. No questions asked. Clara leaned back and pressed her fingertips to her temples, massaging away the tightening in her skull. In her mind, she replayed Beverly's words. "First class isn't for school projects, sweetheart." The casual cruelty of the phrase stung. School projects wasn't a neutral term. It was code for not good enough, not important, not worthy. But Clara wasn't here to prove her project's worth. She was here to observe how those in power treated someone they assumed had none. The Youth Federal Evaluator program had taught her well. Stay calm, stay curious, record everything. She unzipped her backpack and retrieved a slim notebook stamped with the FAA logo. Inside, she flipped to a blank page marked Cabin Interaction Log and wrote in tidy block letters, Event 1, Unverified Removal from 1A, No Boarding Pass Scan. Crew Lead, Beverly Langdon, No Badge Check. Passengers, 34 observed, 2 offered sympathy. She paused, fingernail tapping the paper. The hush of her pen scratching across the page was the only protest she would allow herself. If Beverly believed silence was submission, Clara would show her the power that comes from quiet. The oxygen masks above remained securely stowed. The seatbelt sign blinked on and off. The steward announced final cabin checks in a voice smooth as honey. Clara watched Beverly pass by again, this time moving toward the galley. Beverly's posture was rigid, her stride quick, as though she'd felt the ripple in the cabin's atmosphere. Clara studied her, memorizing angles. The way Beverly's shoulders tensed when she thought no one was watching. The flicker of doubt behind her eyes when the second attendant gently challenged her authority. Every metric mattered. Every crack in the facade was data. She closed her notebook and slid it back into her bag. No grand gestures, no dramatic demands. The flight would proceed, and so would Clara. She leaned her head against the window, peering out at the ribbon of runway below. In the early morning haze, she saw not a path to freedom, but a path to truth. Her heart slowed. The lump of indignation in her throat receded. Clara's parents had taught her that resilience wasn't about never being hurt. It was about carrying the scars with grace. And she carried more than most 14-year-olds. The engines thrummed louder as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Atlantic Blue Flight 274. We will be departing momentarily. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and tray tables secured." A ripple of compliance moved through the cabin. Clara straightened one final time, adjusting her cardigan before securing her seatbelt. She didn't flinch when the plane lurched forward. Instead, she closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "They can take my seat, but they can't own my story." And in that silence, she found her strength. The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin, glinting off polished silverware and the gleaming name tags of the first-class crew. Clara Whitman sat back in her seat, arms folded calmly, as the aircraft leveled off at 35,000 feet. She watched the curtains sway as flight attendants hustled between cabins. In the hush of the luxury section, one presence cut through the routine. Beverly Langdon, the first-class purser and architect of Clara's humiliation. Beverly stood in the galley doorway, mobile in hand, peering over the rim of her designer glasses. With 17 years in the skies, she'd mastered the unspoken hierarchy of privilege that governed every mile flown. To her, the cabin was a finely tuned orchestra, and she, its conductor, ensuring only the right performers had center stage. Today, that meant Clara did not belong. A duo of elderly passengers approached Beverly's station, wrinkled hands clutching a pair of vintage leather suitcases. "Miss Langdon," Mrs. Harper said, "could we have another run of the smoked salmon?" Her voice wavered politely. "Absolutely, Mrs. Harper," Beverly responded, voice smooth as spun silk. She signaled to a junior attendant. "Hold that table," she instructed. "Watch the plating, no smudges on the china." The attendant hurried off. Beverly turned away from Mrs. Harper, twisting her scarf and glancing toward the first-class seats. In her mind, she ran through the guest list. She knew every name by heart: CEOs, venture capitalists, retired judges, people whose business sustained the airline's bottom line. These were real customers, she thought, not children playing dress-up in adult seats. Clara watched the scene, registering every subtle shift in Beverly's posture. The way her shoulders straightened when she thought no one was looking. The way her smile curved just a touch too sharply when greeting the Harpers. On the seatback screen before her, the flight's progress map glowed. But it was Beverly's silent performance that held Clara's attention. Later, in a quieter corner of the galley, Beverly and senior flight attendant Marta Rhodes shared a quick word. Marta, fresh-faced after only 2 years on the job, tucked a curl behind her ear and spoke in a low tone. "Beverly, are you sure about that girl? I mean, she looked like she had a ticket." Beverly leveled her gaze on Marta. "I'm sure. There's a distinction between passengers who fit and those who don't," she said, punctuating the end of her sentence with a slight nod. "Policy is policy. She's a student. I enforce standards." Marta's brow furrowed. "But if she has first-class credentials, shouldn't we verify it properly?" "Verification takes time," Beverly replied briskly. "We have schedule constraints. Boarding was closed. I'll sort it out on the ground." She flipped her tablet shut, as if closing the matter. Clara's chest tightened at overhearing. She knew precisely how cages of power were constructed, one whispered justification at a time. She jotted, "Selective enforcement. Student profile discount?" in her evaluator's notebook. Back in 2A, Beverly glided down the aisle, offering a practiced smile to each passenger she passed. She gave extra attention to the Harpers, refilling their glasses of champagne, engaging them in light banter. As she approached Clara's former seat, she paused, peering through the curtain as though expecting a different sight. Instead, she saw Clara's backpack perched on 29D's fold-down armrest. Beverly's lips curved in a satisfied smirk. Lesson delivered, she thought. Clara caught the smirk from across the aisle. A spark of something like anger flickered, but she breathed it down into resolve. She had protocols to follow. She pressed her fingertips lightly against the leather armrest of 29D, reminding herself that she'd already turned in her report. She was no longer a victim here. She was an evaluator, a sentinel. Minutes later, Beverly checked her watch, noting they were halfway to Boston. She tapped a code into her in-flight system. "Priority assist, gate agent." That signaled to ground staff that any passenger issues would be escalated on arrival. She thought she was covering her bases, ensuring that any challenge to her authority would be handled by someone else at the airport. Clara observed every move, her notebook open but untouched. In her ears, soft white noise from her noise-canceling headphones, just enough to mask cabin chatter. Inside, her mind was sharp as a scalpel. She recognized the strategy. Isolate the supposed interloper, push her aside, outsource the problem. But as part of the Youth Federal Evaluator program, Clara's mission was to capture precisely these tactics. She remembered her mother's words before Clara left Arlington. "They'll try to see you as just another kid, Don't give them that satisfaction. Do your job, pure and simple. That mantra had guided Clara through every test. Now it guided her through the corridors of silver service and whispered judgments. A flight attendant wheeled a snack cart through economy, its bell tinkling. The smell of warmed mixed nuts drifted back to first class. Clara took a slow breath, focusing on the simple comfort of routine. This was her element. Systems, procedures, data. She reminded herself she was not here for revenge or publicity. She was here for accountability. In the galley, Beverly clicked through the passenger manifest, her finger pausing at Clara's name. She frowned, as if measuring the length of that name against some invisible standard. "Whitman," she muttered. The name stirred a memory, a high-profile advisory board meeting she'd once served on. But she pushed it away. No matter, she thought. She's just a kid. Yet even as Beverly scrolled away, her fingers hesitated before hitting confirm. A flicker of doubt passed over her shoulders. For the first time, she seemed less than certain. Clara, watching from her seat, sensed the shift. She recognized that gap between confidence and conviction as the moment when true power emerges. Clara closed her evaluator's notebook and tucked it into her backpack. She returned her gaze to the window, where the sky stretched, infinite and calm. Power, she understood, wasn't measured in who could shout the loudest. It was measured in who could hold silence and still command attention, and then act. Below, the wing reflected the sun's path toward Boston. Clara took one last look at Beverly, who stood straight and proud in the galley, unaware she was already under formal review. And Clara, with quiet certainty, pressed the button on her phone that silently completed her report. The hum of the engines built toward the descent. Beverly would soon find out that authority can slip through tight fists, especially when someone in the back row is watching, waiting, and recording every move. And for Clara Whitman, that knowledge was more powerful than any first-class seat. A sudden hush fell over Atlantic Blue 274 as the curtain between first class and the rest of the cabin fluttered closed. Clara Whitman perched in seat 29D, her shoulders rigid, eyes fixed straight ahead. Her tablet lay closed in her lap, notes untapped. A dozen rows of premium economy passengers watched in startled silence. Beyond them, the first-class cabin had paused its silver service as though the plane itself were holding its breath. Moments earlier, Beverly Langdon had summoned Clara back through that curtain, this time for everyone to see. She'd appeared at the threshold with the clipped authority of someone used to command. "Ladies and gentlemen," she'd announced, voice clear and brisk, "I'm placing a passenger in the back while we verify her credentials." Her words echoed in the polished cabin like a gavel striking wood. Clara felt every eye pin her shoulders. A businessman in 29C raised an eyebrow. The couple in 29B whispered behind pursed lips. The seatbelt signs above them chirped on, demanding that everyone remain seated, but eyes lifted like sunflowers turning toward a distant light. Even the flight attendants paused in their tasks, trays halfway extended. Shiny service carts stalled. Nothing in Clara's 14 years had prepared her for this moment. In school, a wrong answer might draw a whispered giggle or a raised eyebrow from her classmates. Here, on a plane, thousands of feet above the ground, her mistake as unqualified passenger spread through the cabin faster than any rumor. She swallowed, stifled the urge to push back a strand of hair, and pressed her palms flat against the arms of the seat. Beverly's silhouette moved forward. In her hand, she held Clara's boarding pass like evidence. She read the name aloud. Clara Whitman, seat 1A. Then Beverly paused, her eyes scanning the cabin, and addressed the entire cabin again, this time louder. "It appears this young lady's seat was assigned in error," she said, tone clipped. "First class is reserved for our fare-paying adult guests. Please accept my apology for the mix-up, ma'am, but you will need to sit in economy." The word apology was a bitter joke. No apology was ever meant. As Beverly turned and swept out of view, Passengers exhaled collectively. A woman in 30A muttered under her breath, "How rude." A child clutched his mother's hand. A suited man fumbled with his boarding pass, his face pale. Clara rose slowly, each movement a study in controlled dignity. She tucked her hair behind her ear, folded her hands over the backpack strap, and began the short walk toward economy. Her shins brushed the aisle armrests, and she pushed off the seat with a gentle motion, as though in defiance of gravity itself. At row 29, she paused, glancing back through the curtain one final time. The first-class cabin was frozen, silver trays half set, half-empty flutes of champagne quivering like captured photons. In that moment, it wasn't just her seat that had been taken. It was her place in the world, questioned and dismissed. She sat down in 29D, heart hammering, and took a shaky breath. The man across the aisle offered her a small nod, quick and awkward, as if he were apologizing for being powerless. Clara's lips curved in a faint, thankful smile before she turned her gaze back to the window. The sky outside was impossibly blue, endless. Inside, the cabin resumed its low hum. Flight attendants redistributed blankets. Trolleys rattled by. Yet Clara felt isolated in a bubble of humiliation. Each jingle of cutlery, each rustle of magazines, hammered home the message. She did not belong there. She closed her eyes for a moment, repeating the mantra her mother had taught. Observe, record, remain calm. She tapped a quick note in her FAA Evaluator app. Public removal, no scan. Verbal announcement in aisle 4, passenger reaction. Confused murmurs, no intervention. As the plane leveled off, cabin lights dimmed to cruise setting. Water glasses trembled on trays. Clara drew her knees close, folding into a protective posture. She pictured her mother's reassuring voice. "You're doing exactly what you should. They're the ones who look small now." Across the aisle, a flight attendant paused to offer Clara a bottle of water. The gesture was quiet. No announcement, no spotlight. Just a simple act of kindness. Clara nodded her thanks, accepting the cool plastic. In that small kindness, there was a spark of humanity she tucked away for strength. Meanwhile, in first class, Beverly regrouped. She straightened her jacket, smoothed her scarf, and returned to her post with the precision of someone who believed she'd done the right thing. She was the guardian of standards, she told herself. But an uneasy question flickered in her mind. Did we check properly? That flicker grew as the flight attendants on each aisle exchanged silent looks. The man in 1C, the woman in 1D. They all wondered if Beverly had gone too far. And though they said nothing, the charged atmosphere rippled through the cabin. Clara leaned back, listening to the whir of air vents, the soft ping of seatbelt signs. She pressed the send button on her phone. Public removal, no check, protocol breach logged, code 4A. Then she slipped the phone into her pocket. Here, vulnerability was power. In public, she'd been stripped of a seat. Now, through silence and documentation, she was gathering the evidence that would eventually upend an entire crew. The engines hummed, wings cut through cloud like knives through silk, and Clara Whitman settled into her narrowed world of observation. In that silence, a storm was quietly gathering, one that no one on the plane, not even Beverly Langdon, would see coming. Clara Whitman leaned back in her seat, folding her arms neatly across her chest as the cabin lights dimmed to cruise setting. The initial shock of being marched from first class had faded into a heavy, humming tension that settled over every passenger. A dozen rows ahead, Beverly Langdon continued her rounds, her posture still rigid with authority. But around Clara, the atmosphere had shifted, fractured by whispers, puzzled looks, and small acts of quiet solidarity. An older gentleman in 30B leaned over to his companion, voice hushed but urgent enough for Clara to catch. "Did you see how she was treated? That girl had every right to be up front." His friend shook her head, adjusting her scarf. "Unbelievable. You'd think they'd at least scan her ticket." Clara traced the pattern of the seatbelt sign above her with her eyes, as if willing it to blink off and on again. Inside, she felt each word like a pulse, proof that not everyone was willing to turn away. A flight attendant passed through economy, glancing at Clara with a flicker of recognition in her eyes before tucking it away behind a professional mask. Moments later, a woman 2 rows back in 31D reached over and gently touched Clara's arm. Clara's breath caught. The woman whispered, "Here, you might need this." She pressed a small folded tissue into Clara's hand and offered a sympathetic smile. Clara nodded silently, folding the tissue into her palm like a talisman. It wasn't charity, it was acknowledgement. A young couple in 32E and 32F watched with furrowed brows. The man fidgeted with his phone, likely drafting a tweet. The woman whispered, "If she'd been a man in a suit, none of this would have happened." The man exhaled sharply. Clara let their words wash over her, another data set for her evaluator's log. Back in the galley, junior flight attendant Marta Rhodes hovered near Beverly. Clara couldn't hear every word, but she caught enough to know the junior attendant was questioning the decision. Marta, quietly, "Boss, I thought her ticket was verified like everyone else's." Beverly, brisk, "Marta, you'll learn soon enough that procedure doesn't always keep pace with reality." Marta's shoulders slumped, her eyes dropping to the floor in defeat. Clara recognized that look. She'd worn it herself when her own ideas were dismissed. In that instant, Clara wondered how many other would-be allies were silenced by deference to authority. Clara reached into her backpack and pulled out her FAA evaluator's notebook. On a fresh page, she wrote, "Witness reactions, 3 supportive gestures, tissue offer, whispered defense, attendant's doubt. Atmosphere, tense, fractured trust, silent questioning." She tapped her pen against the paper. The rules of the Youth Federal Evaluator Program stressed impartiality. Observe without interfering. But the data she was gathering felt like a lifeline. It told a story of courage in small acts, of quiet defiance in the face of blatant discrimination. A child in 33C craned his neck toward the curtain separating cabins. His wide eyes tracked Clara's face, curious but kindly. His mother shushed him gently, but even the hush of a mother's hand carried a thrum of rebellion. She knew what had happened was wrong. Clara offered the boy a small nod of acknowledgement, and he gave her a half smile before leaning back, transfixed by a cartoon on the seatback screen. In 30A, a middle-aged businessman cleared his throat as Beverly passed with a tray of drinks. He watched Beverly's polished shoes click on the carpet, then looked at Clara as though waiting for some sign from her. Clara's expression remained calm, unreadable. It was as if she existed in a bubble of resolve, bearing the humiliation but refusing to be defined by it. Clara thought of her mother's voice. "People will see what they choose to see. You're here to reveal their choices." She closed her eyes and centered herself on the steady thrum of the engines. Each vibration through the floor seemed to underscore her purpose. She wasn't a powerless child. She was an embedded observer, an instrument of accountability. A flight attendant wheeled a snack cart through the economy rows, the bell tinkling like a distant chime. Clara caught the attendant's eye as she passed and gave a slight raise of her eyebrows, an unspoken thank you for the normalcy of service. The attendant offered a quick smile and a pause, hands hovering over the cart as though resisting the urge to say something. Clara turned back to her notebook and jotted, "Crew morale, visibly shaken, some doubt, but public facade remains intact." She paused, letting the pen hover above the page. She felt a pang of guilt. Had she set them up to fail? The program's premise depended on unfiltered behavior, but at what cost? Clara's chest tightened as an unexpected twinge of empathy flickered. But then she remembered how quickly false confidence can lead to abuse of power. Her recording wouldn't be cruelty, it would be truth. In the first-class cabin beyond the curtain, Clara could see Beverly consulting her tablet, probably reviewing passenger manifests, confirming schedules. Beverly's back was turned, but Clara sensed tension radiating from her posture. The dynamic had already shifted. The very fact that Beverly had to oversee a correction signaled a crack in her authority. Clara tapped her pen thrice. That counts as a win. Around her, the cabin settled into a low murmur. Brakes on, trays being stowed, the soft whoosh of vents. The world within that fuselage kept moving, unaware of the storm quietly building on the plane's floor. Clara tucked her notebook away and returned her gaze to the window, where endless sky unfurled toward the horizon. She exhaled, feeling the tightness in her chest loosen like a knot undone. The witnesses were there, in the whispered apologies, the subtle head tilts of disapproval, the small kindnesses. Their presence mattered. Each tiny act chipped away at Beverly's conviction that she could wield power without consequence. Clara pressed one fingertip to the FAA app icon on her phone. It glowed softly in the dim cabin light. In one more entry, she summarized, recorded multiple public reactions, indicators of systemic bias, escalation threshold met. She hit send. No fanfare, no spotlight. Just a silent button press that would trigger the next stage of the clear deck protocol. Soon, the storm would arrive, and everyone who'd stayed silent would have to face the fallout. For now, Clara leaned her head back, eyes closed, letting the muted engine roar and the gentle pressurization lull her into a state of calm readiness. In the quiet, she felt an ember of satisfaction. Justice was not about spectacle, but about confronting wrongdoing. And sometimes, that required only a single, silent act to set the whole system in motion. The cabin lights brightened slightly as the captain announced their descent. Clara opened her eyes, wiping away a phantom tear. She gathered her belongings with deliberate care. In her heart, she carried the knowledge that those who'd watched had already started to change, a shift invisible to Beverly's watchful gaze. And when the plane finally touched down, the silent witnesses would become part of a reckoning that no one in uniform could ignore. Clara Whitman closed her evaluator's notebook and slipped it back into her backpack. She let her fingers rest on her phone for a moment, feeling the gentle hum of the cabin's pressurization beneath her. The world outside the window was a blur of white clouds and brilliant sunshine, unchanged, serene, unknowing. Inside, a storm was quietly gathering. She tapped the screen, navigating to the secure FAA Youth Evaluator app. A single message sat in her draft folder. Unverified removal from 1A, no scan. Public announcement, code 4A logged. Her thumb hovered above the send button, heart pounding. One click and the app would encrypt her report and transmit it straight into the FAA's national compliance system. A network so secret that even most airline executives didn't know of its existence. Clara exhaled, thinking of her mother, Dr. Elise Whitman, who had designed this very program to catch lapses in service and safeguard young passengers. No one on board suspected that 274 was hosting a live test. She pressed send. The button glowed, then dimmed, as if acknowledging the gravity of what had just occurred. Clara gently tucked her phone away without a glance, folding her hands over her notebook once more. Around her, the cabin carried on. A pair of flight attendants stowed the snack cart. Passengers adjusted their seats, and the engines droned steadily. At FAA headquarters, Washington, D.C. On the 42nd floor of a glass-walled annex, rows of consoles flickered with data streams from hundreds of flights. The Youth Compliance Dashboard sat front and center, a grid of color-coded tiles, each representing a flight under covert evaluation. Most glowed green, no issues detected. One tile blinked red. AB 274, violation level 1. Operations Specialist Maya Chen sat at the console, her brow furrowed. She clicked the tile, expanding a pop-up that detailed Clara's report. Passenger, Clara Whitman, 14. Incident, unverified removal from first class. Procedure, public announcement, Code 4A. Maya's fingertip hovered over the escalate icon. Level 1 alerts already required secondary review, but this was Level 1 with a minor under the Youth Evaluator program, a special category. The protocol was clear: immediate implementation of the Clear Deck Directive. She opened the secure comm channel. "Director Whitman," she said, voice calm but urgent. "We have a Code 4A incident on AB-274, public removal without verification, requesting Clear Deck authorization." From the other end, only silence. Maya counted 4 beats. Then came the familiar click of a high-security line being activated. "Proceed," said Dr. Whitman's measured voice. "Implement Clear Deck protocol. Notify flight operations. Hold AB-274. Dispatch compliance officers on landing." "Understood," Maya replied, fingers flying over the keyboard. A flurry of encrypted messages spilled into multiple FAA systems: flight standards, regional operations, and the FAA command center. On the plane. In 29D, Clara felt the cabin shift just slightly, as if the lights dimmed a fraction or the hum of the engines dipped in pitch. She glanced up at the seatbelt sign. Illuminated. She sat still, expression neutral. She hadn't expected to feel anything directly, but she did. A subtle change in the plane's energy, like a collective intake of breath. A few rows ahead, a flight attendant paused mid-step, phone in hand. She looked around, momentarily uncertain. Passengers noticed. Murmurs rose briefly before settling again. The first-class purser, Beverly, returned to her station, but something in her stride was off. Her back slightly hunched, her chin dipped. Clara returned her gaze to her lap, heart calm. She'd done her part. Now she waited. FAA Command Center. Moments later, red alerts popped on half a dozen screens. A map of the continental U.S. glowed, with AB-274 marked in bold red. "No taxi, no departure." "Air traffic control has been notified," Maya reported. "AB-274 will remain at the gate upon landing. Ground teams are en route. All crew on standby for debrief." Deputy Director Vargas nodded across the room. "Ensure they know this is non-negotiable. That girl's report is valid." Maya tapped another key. A high-priority message jolted into the battered tablet in Beverly's hands, assuming she still had it. "Aboard 274, approaching descent." Clara watched the sun dip behind a wisp of cloud, altering the light to a soft blush. She closed her eyes, recalling the surreal hush that fell when she'd sent her report. Pilot Danny Brooks's calm voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts remain fastened." Clara's eyes fluttered open. She glanced toward the curtain where first class met the rest of the cabin. Beverly stood there, mouth set in a thin line, scrolling on her tablet. Beverly's face flicked toward Clara for a split second. Surprise? Or fear? Clara couldn't tell, but she registered the tiny crease between Beverly's brows. Returned to FAA headquarters, Dr. Whitman joined a video conference with the regional operations team. On screen, the director's composed face filled the frame, her voice measured. "AB-274 has triggered a Clear Deck event. The entire crew is suspended pending federal review. This is to safeguard the integrity of our standards and protect all minors in our airspace. No exceptions." The team nodded. A buzz of activity rose. Legal would prepare notices, press would be briefed, and compliance officers would board AB-274 the moment it docked. Inside Clara's head, Clara pressed her temples, trying not to smile. She didn't feel vindictive, just resolved. She'd executed her role to perfection. Silent, precise, unassailable. The tiny communique she'd sent had roared through the FAA's channels, setting in motion a process that no single person on the plane could blunt. She glanced at the cabin lights pulsing above and tapped her pen quietly against her notebook. On a new page, she penned 3 words and a code. "Clear Deck protocol activated. Measure success, 100%. Clara snapped the notebook shut, tucked it away, and returned her gaze to the window as the runway lights came into view. In moments, the storm she'd summoned would break, quietly, decisively, and irrevocably. And she, the invisible sentinel, would watch it all from her seat. The descent lights blinked off as the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been instructed to hold our position at the gate upon landing. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Further information will be provided shortly." A collective murmur rose and fell like tidal waves through the cabin. In first class, Beverly Langdon froze mid-stride, her hand poised over a tray of champagne flutes. In premium economy, passengers leaned forward, eyebrows raised. Even in the back, a hush replaced the usual bustle as though the entire plane had inhaled in surprise. Clara Whitman sat perfectly still in 29D, her back against the seat, her eyes steady on the curtain dividing the cabins. She felt the gentle deceleration as the plane taxied toward the gate, the wheels whispering against concrete. Around her, the subtle jolt and hiss of landing gear descending seemed amplified, as if the aircraft itself were gearing down for a sudden pause in time. A flight attendant paused at Clara's seat, hand hovering over the call button. Her face was pale, her eyes flicked toward the galley, searching for direction. Clara offered a calm nod, the slightest acknowledgement that no further action was needed. The attendant nodded back, retreating into the aisle to help other passengers buckle in. In first class, Beverly regrouped behind the curtain. She pressed a hand to her forehead, her fist clenching the edge of the galley counter. Marta Rhodes hovered behind her, concern etched on her young face. "Ma'am, do you know what's happening?" Marta whispered. Beverly shook her head, her lips pressed tight. "No," she said, voice low, "but it's coming from FAA headquarters." She tapped at her tablet, scrolling through encrypted messages. Marta watched her, fear in her eyes. Back in economy, Clara opened her evaluator's notebook and wrote, "Hold at gate. Clear deck protocol in effect. Observed crew confusion, passenger murmur." She tapped a quick summary into the app, then closed it. It was time to watch. A hush rippled through the cabin as the jet came to rest. The seatbelt sign stayed lit. Passengers exchanged worried glances. A woman in 15C near the emergency exit raised her voice, barely above a whisper. "Why are we holding?" A businessman in 15D scrolled his phone. "Air traffic says there's an FAA directive." Clara's heart beat in measured cadence. She leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees, eyes scanning the curtains. Beyond that threshold, her evaluator's report was unfolding in real time. Moments later, two figures appeared at the top of the jet bridge stairs. They wore dark FAA uniforms, sharp, authoritative. One carried a slim briefcase, the other held a tablet. They paused at the curtain's edge. In the galley, Beverly's shoulders tensed as she noticed the newcomers. Marta stepped back, eyes wide. Passengers in first class sat forward, champagne glasses forgotten. The FAA officers walked with deliberate calm into the cabin, each step clicking on the carpet like a verdict being read. The taller officer cleared his throat. His voice, carried through a handheld microphone, was low but firm. "I'm Special Agent Ramirez, Federal Aviation Administration. We are here under Directive FAA D-71 to conduct an immediate crew compliance review. All flight crew members operating Flight AB-274 are to remain at their stations for debrief." Beverly's face drained of color. She straightened, unfastened her scarf, and stepped forward. Clara saw every flicker of fear and defiance on her face. The officer's gaze swept the cabin, locking onto Beverly. "Chief Purser Langdon," he continued, "please come forward." As Beverly stepped into the aisle, passengers craned their necks. The hush deepened. In economy, a mother pulled her child's arm gently, pointing discreetly at Beverly. Across the rows, people watched as a uniformed authority confronted an airline legend. Clara felt a surge of conflicted relief. No triumph, only quiet satisfaction that protocol was holding. She returned to her notebook and wrote, "Compliance officers boarding. Chief Purser under review. Passenger attention 100%. Behind her, the cabin crew stowed service items with trembling hands. An attendant in 28F nearly dropped a tray before a colleague caught it. The man in 29C rose, phone already out, recording a video. Clara's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from purpose. This was accountability in action. The officers led Beverly to a row of empty seats at the front. She sat, shoulders squared but head bowed slightly, awaiting questioning. The officer's tablet lit up as he reviewed the incident report. Marta hovered in the galley, biting her lip. A junior attendant offered Beverly a cup of water, but she shook her head. In the economy cabin, soft conversation started, passengers whispering about what had just happened, piecing together fragments. A woman in 31B shook her head. "I've flown hundreds of times. I've never seen this." A man in 32C leaned back, exhaling. "I'm glad she did the right thing." Clara watched it all, every expression etched into memory. Her role was not to judge individual compassion, but to capture the pattern, how people respond when they realize they've been complicit in injustice. The FAA officers completed their initial questions and moved on to the rest of the crew. Flight attendants sorted through logs. One by one, they were asked to remain in their seats until clearance. A steward who had served coffee in first class earlier looked at Clara with a pang of guilt. Clara met his eyes and offered a gentle nod. No condemnation, just recognition of shared humanity. Outside, ground crews paused, equipment at the ready, uncertain why the jet wasn't disembarking. The hold would ripple through schedules at multiple airports. Clara's mother had anticipated this completely. The clear deck protocol wasn't just punitive. It was preventive, ensuring that no addicted habit of assumed privilege could go unchecked. Clara leaned back, letting the cabin's tension wash over her. No one spoke loudly, yet every rustle of fabric, every tapping fingertip, every drawn-in breath spoke volumes. She closed her notebook, noting, "Crew compliance review underway, passenger solidarity increasing, flight delay, 30 minutes." Then she tucked it away, slid the tablet from her bag, and opened her email. A secure message from her mother awaited. "Well done. Proceed to final observation. Debrief upon arrival." Clara glanced up at the FAA officers moving methodically through the aisles. She felt a deep, quiet pride, not for herself, but for the system her mother had built, and for the passengers who, in their own small ways, had chosen to bear witness. As the cabin settled into an uneasy calm, Clara Whitman closed her eyes for a moment. The plane remained at the gate, engines ticking over. Outside, the runway lights glowed in the dusk. Inside, justice had taken its first steps. Quiet, unwavering, and exactly on schedule. Beverly Langdon stood at the galley bulkhead, arms crossed over her chest, jaw clenched. Through the curtain, she could just make out rows of first-class seats, empty champagne flutes, half-set silverware, each one a reminder of the authority she'd wielded only hours ago. Now, a tremor of doubt ran through her spine, and it wouldn't let go. She tapped her tablet, hoping for a reassuring all clear from flight operations. Instead, the screen flashed a new alert. FAA compliance review in progress. All crew subject to immediate debrief. The message lingered, blinking once, twice, as if daring her to acknowledge it. "Do I look like I belong under investigation?" Beverly muttered, voice low. She shoved the tablet into her bag and faced Marta Rhodes, her junior attendant. Marta's eyes were wide, brimming with unspoken concern. Marta swallowed. "Ma'am, I heard from the Purser's channel. They're sending federal agents onto the jet bridge as soon as we dock." Beverly's professional mask cracked. Her lips pressed into a thin line. That can't happen, not without proper cause." "But it was from FAA headquarters," Marta pressed. "Priority level 1, they're blacklisting the crew." Beverly's hand went to her scarf, twisting the fabric between trembling fingers. Her pulse hammered in her ears as if to announce her impending downfall. She had spent decades cultivating a reputation for flawless service, 17 years of perfect performance records, and now, in the blink of an eye, it might all be erased. A gentle cough snapped Beverly's attention forward. Captain Hughes, pausing in the aisle, cleared his throat. His uniform was impeccable, but his gaze held sympathy. "Beverly," he said quietly, "air traffic control just confirmed. We can't taxi to the runway. They're refusing clearance." Beverly's throat tightened. She opened her mouth to protest, but the captain held up a hand. "I'm sorry. It's an FAA directive. I thought you'd want to know." She nodded with effort, her posture rigid. "Thank you, Captain." She turned away, pivoting on one heel so quickly her scarf swung out like a shroud. In the seat behind her, Clara Whitman watched from the edge of 29D. Clara's face was impassive, but her notebook lay open in her lap, already marked. Crew morale broken. Authority fracturing. Beverly didn't notice Clara. She wouldn't realize Clara's role until it was too late. Beverly moved through the cabin, her heels clicking on the carpet. She stopped at a seat 1C, just long enough to flash a tight, forced-sized smile at the Harpers. "We appreciate your patience," she said. Her tone was smooth, but there was no warmth. The Harpers exchanged worried glances. She pressed on to the galley, trailing a wake of silent tension. The junior attendant in premium economy caught her eye and gave a small, apologetic nod. Beverly paused, searching her memory for a proper response. Something gracious, something that would restore a sliver of control. Instead, she found herself whispering, "Thank you," and hurrying off before the attendant could see her fear. Behind the curtain, Beverly leaned against the stainless steel counter. She closed her eyes, pinching the bridge of her nose. "What have I done?" The question echoed louder than any passenger's gasp earlier. She replayed the moment she'd forced Clara from 1A, the way she'd assumed authority, bypassing procedure. Now that same procedure was swallowing her whole. Marta appeared beside her, voice hesitant. "Beverly, please let me handle passenger inquiries?" Beverly glanced at her, eyes rimmed with fatigue. She wanted to say, "Go away," but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded curtly. Marta slipped away, leaving Beverly alone with the cold metal of the counter. She closed her eyes again, hearing only the hum of the environmental system. Her heartbeat steadied for a moment, then skipped as her tablet buzzed in her bag. She fished it out and saw, "Top secret, FAA Command Center, AB-274 crew blacklist update. All active flight crew removed from roster. Federal investigation pending." Beverly stared at the words, unable to process them fully. Blacklisted. A term she'd once associated only with corporate scandals or criminal conspiracies. And now it applied to her and her team. Their careers snatched away at 35,000 feet. Her lips trembled. She tapped the tablet screen until the message vanished, replaced by schedule updates for incoming flights. Deadlines and gate assignments that now would never matter. Clara observed it all. Even from economy, she could see Beverly's silhouette tremor in the galley light. Clara tucked that image away, data point 9.4, as the most telling sign of bias being met with accountability. Below them, ground crews prepared the jet bridge. Engines ticked as hydraulics adjusted. Passengers began to murmur, glancing up at the gate doors, curious about the delay. In a few minutes, they'd see the officers step on board. Beverly straightened, taking a shaky breath. She ran a hand through her hair, smoothing a strand that had come loose. "Compose yourself," she thought. "You're still the authority on this aircraft." But the authority felt as fragile as a snowflake on warm skin. She rounded the curtain into economy, standing for a few seconds just beyond Clara's line of sight. Her back was rigid, her head bowed slightly. A passenger in 30F cleared his throat. "Miss," he said, tentatively, "is everything okay?" Beverly's jaw clenched. She turned, offering a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes," she said, voice hollow. "Everything is fine." Clara watched the exchange, then looked away, pressing her palms flat on her notebook. She wrote, "Chief Purser denies issue, but crisis evident. Code 5, leadership breakdown." Beverly nodded at the passenger and slipped back into first class. The curtain closed behind her with a soft swish, sealing her off from the world she'd governed so confidently. In that quiet moment, she was alone with the magnitude of her mistake, grappling with the knowledge that every assumption she made, every shortcut, every ignored protocol, had come home to roost. And all the while, Clara Whitman sat in 29D, silent and steady, watching the gate lights flicker in the growing dusk. The storm was almost upon them, and Beverly Langdon had just realized that there was no hiding from it. The jet bridge settled against the door with a soft clunk, and a pair of steel-toed shoes clicked onto the cabin floor. Clara Whitman tensed in her seat, eyes widening behind her tablet's dark screen. Through the curtain, she glimpsed two figures in crisp FAA uniforms, navy jackets, silver buttons, stepping into first class. Every eye in the cabin turned toward them, the hush falling deeper than any before. Clara watched as the taller officer raised a gloved hand. His voice, delivered through a small microphone, cut through the silence like a scalpel. "Ladies and gentlemen, by order of the Federal Aviation Administration, I am placing flight crew AB-274 under immediate compliance review." He paused, letting the words sink in. Clara felt her pulse slow, her breath catch. The cabin had gone completely still. Glasses stopped mid-clink, hands frozen in mid-gesture. Even the hum of the air vents seemed to fade. Chief Purser Beverly Langdon and all crew members assigned to this flight are hereby suspended from duty pending further investigation. This action is effective immediately. Passengers will please remain seated while the crew disembarks. The second officer clicked his heels, stepped forward, and extended a clipboard toward Beverly. Clara watched as Beverly, muscles rigid, took it with trembling fingers. Her perfectly coiffed hair fell into her eyes. She brushed it back, chin high, though her shoulders sagged ever so slightly. The officer's gaze remained steady, impartial. A woman in 1B gasped. A man in 2C pressed his phone into recording mode, the red light blinking. Clara felt a rush of triumph, not for her own sake, but for truth. Beverly had overlooked every protocol in her haste to assert power. Now, every passenger was witnessing the cost. In the back, the flight attendants who had once moved with confident precision now slumped toward each other. Marta Rhodes caught Clara's eye through the curtain. Clara offered a small, sympathetic smile. Marta's lips quivered, but she nodded. An unspoken thank you to the girl who refused to speak up yet commanded the cabin's attention through unwavering presence. Soon, Beverly and her team began the walk of removal. They passed down the aisle in single file, badges flashing under the cabin lights. Passengers held their breath. Some looked away, unable to meet Beverly's eyes. Others whispered quietly, "I can't believe it. She didn't even scan the ticket. I'm glad someone did something." Clara slipped her notebook from her lap and scribbled, 10. Public reckoning. Chief Purser and crew suspended at gate. Passenger solidarity. High. She tapped the entry into her FAA app, then snapped it shut. The only sound now was the soft shuffle of uniforms and the distant wheeze of hydraulics as the jet bridge adjusted. At the cabin's midpoint, the officers paused. One turned to address the entire plane again. "Thank you for your patience. FAA compliance officers will complete their review on the ground. You will be updated as soon as possible." Then, without another word, they strode through the gap in the jet bridge wall and disappeared. The door closed behind them with a mechanical sigh, leaving behind a first-class cabin that felt emptied of certainty. Beverly lingered at the curtain edge, lost in a sea of seats she no longer commanded. The moment stretched, an echo chamber of remorse and bewilderment. Finally, she stepped into economy, where Clara sat motionless. Beverly's eyes met Clara's for a heartbeat. Fear, regret, something unspoken, before Beverly turned and walked down the aisle toward freedom from judgment. Passengers in economy watched the exodus with a mixture of relief and awkward guilt. The man in 15D nudged his wife. "Should we say something?" he murmured. The woman shook her head. "Better we let it pass," she whispered. Clara nodded to herself. True justice required no applause. The cabin's normal bustle crept back in small measures. A flight attendant re-entered to collect service items. Another checked seatbelts. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. The story of what had happened would ripple outward, through calls to friends, posts on social media, and official FAA bulletins. Clara closed her eyes, letting the wave of tension wash over her one last time. Then she opened them, steely calm returning. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Power lies in quiet observation and decisive action. In that silence, Clara had shifted the balance of authority mid-flight. She organized her notes, careful and deliberate, cleaned fingerprints from her tablet, and slid both back into her backpack. The engines idled, an expectant lull before passenger disembarkation. Clara buckled her seatbelt one final time, not because she needed to, but because the ritual reminded her of every rule she'd honored, even when others abandoned them. A beam of afternoon light angled through the window and warmed her face. She pressed a hand to her heart, steadying the rapid beat, and exhaled. The seatbelt sign finally dinged off. Her fellow passengers straightened, gathering their belongings. Clara rose, slung her backpack over one shoulder, and approached the curtain separating cabins. On the other side, the first-class cabin was silent and empty of its crew. Clara slipped through the gap, stepping into a realm of neat leather seats and untouched service. She paused at 1A, the seat that had been hers, revoked and then restored in her own way. She traced her fingertip along the armrest, recalling Beverly's harsh words, the judgment in the cabin, and the hush that followed her calm defiance. No one clapped. No one cheered. Instead, Clara turned and walked toward economy, the pulse of the cabin echoing behind her. She felt the weight of every gaze, not with shame, but with the quiet authority of someone who'd endured, observed, and ultimately prevailed. As she departed the plane at last, her steps light but certain, Clara Whitman knew the real reckoning was just beginning. On the tarmac, in FAA memos, and in the hearts of every passenger who'd watched a quiet teen girl flip the script on a flight crew. And for the first time that day, she allowed herself a small, private smile. The cabin felt impossibly still as the last flight attendant stepped into the aisle, escorted by two federal agents whose crisp navy uniforms contrasted sharply with the sleek white and gray of Atlantic Blue's interior. One by one, the crew members, those who'd smiled at first-class guests mere hours ago, filed through the cabin like exiles, their polished name tags glinting under the soft overhead lights. Passengers held their breath. Champagne flutes trembled on silver trays. A businesswoman in 2B clutched her silk scarf, eyes wide. Behind her, a retired judge in 2C shifted uneasily in his seat. No one applauded. No one jeered. They simply watched as authority itself was dismantled in slow motion. Clara Whitman sat quietly in 1A, the seat restored to her earlier that morning. She had returned here with no fanfare, no raised voice, no confrontation, only the calm certainty that comes from knowing you've done the right thing. Now she watched the aisle, her heart steady, as everyone she'd observed earlier passed before her. The lead agent paused at seat 1B and spoke in a low but firm voice. "Chief Purser Beverly Langdon, Senior Flight Attendants Marta Rhodes and Eric Dawson, and the rest of your team are suspended pending federal review. Please disembark in an orderly fashion." Beverly nodded once, shoulders squared, lips pressed together. She offered no argument, only a brief, regret-tinged glance toward Clara before she followed the agent out of the cabin. Behind her, Marta and Eric gave Clara furtive looks. Glances of apology, of fear, of something that might have been relief. They too walked past, their heads bowed. A hush reigned for several heartbeat-long seconds. Then, from somewhere near row 3, a voice broke the silence. I should have asked what was really going on." No one replied, but heads turned. The man who'd spoken, a gray-haired executive with a leather briefcase, looked chagrined as he adjusted his tie. A woman beside him nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Clara felt a twinge of compassion for them. These strangers had been complicit in silence, just as she had seen in her middle school science fairs or debate tournaments. Everyone loves a winner, but no one wants to be the one to call foul. She leaned forward slightly, resting her fingertips on the plush armrest, and watched the final steward slip off the plane. He paused, catching Clara's eye, and gave her a subtle nod, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed. Clara nodded back, offering a quiet "thank you" that needed no words. All 50-odd passengers remained seated, absorbing what they'd witnessed. A flight attendant from premium economy re-entered the cabin to collect service items, her steps tentative. She met Clara's gaze and gave a sympathetic half-smile. Clara offered hers in return, a bond of shared understanding and moral clarity. The jet bridge door clicked closed behind the departing crew, and the hush began to fracture. Soft conversations resumed, tentative at first. A couple in 4E leaned toward each other. "She didn't scream or cry," the woman whispered. "She just stood her ground." A mother tucked a blanket around her child in 4F. "That girl was brave," she murmured. Clara pressed her palms together and quietly tapped an entry in her FAA Evaluators app. Chapter 11. Crew suspension complete. Passenger acknowledgement rising. Silent accountability. A flight attendant in first class, one who'd remained after the purge, entered with a tray of glassware. She placed it gently on the cart and paused to look at Clara. "I'm so sorry," she said, voice low. There was no need to name the apology's target. Clara understood implicitly. Clara stood and tucked her tablet under her arm. She felt the eyes of every passenger on her, not with pity, but with respect, an unspoken acknowledgement that she'd held firm when others remained silent. At the curtain, she glanced back at the empty posts, once filled by uniformed crew. The seats looked abandoned, soup bowls of spilled champagne left abandoned. The lacquered countertops in the galley gleamed under the lights, now unblemished evidence of a disruption. Clara imagined those stations in disarray, a hangar filled with staff scrambling to replace schedules and reassign flights. She turned her gaze forward and walked with even steps through the curtain into premium economy. The atmosphere here was different. Relieved chatter, subdued gratitude, and a sense of collective relief. The couple in 4E stepped aside to let her pass. The man in 2C, who'd spoken earlier, touched her shoulder gently. "Thank you," he said. Clara nodded again. No words needed. Soon, she reached row 29, where she'd sat silently for most of the flight. She paused at 29D, the seat where she'd recorded every reaction and observed every nuance. She lightly touched the back of the seat, as if offering thanks to its cushion for sheltering her during the ordeal. Sitting down, Clara crossed her legs and pressed her bag into her lap. She closed her eyes and let herself breathe in the sounds of a cabin waking from its stupor. Carts rolling, seatbelt signs clicking off, engines ticking. Outside the window, the ramp lights of Boston Logan International shone in the dusk, welcoming her home. In her mind, Clara replayed the moment the crew had filed out, each uniformed figure walking past her, every clink of federal badge, every hush. She thought of the man who confessed, "I should have asked," of the mother and child who'd witnessed her composure, of Marta's hesitant apology. Every detail reinforced a truth she'd known from the start. Sometimes power isn't a shout, but a whisper, and sometimes justice arrives in silence. Clara opened her notebook one last time and wrote, "Passengers, 52 recorded reactions: compassion, regret, solidarity. Systemic change imminent. She snapped the notebook shut and slid it into her bag. The lights in the cabin shifted to gate mode, brightening as if to signal the end of her long test. As the door opened at her row, Clara stood and offered her seatbelt for release. A flight attendant from Premium Economy gently unclasped it. Clara gathered her belongings and gave her seat one final glance. Once her challenge ground, now her vantage point to the world's unfolding accountability. Stepping off the plane, she took a breath of crisp evening air. The hum of tarmac vehicles mixed with distant announcements. Clara looked back at the jet bridge, where federal officers still lingered beyond the door. She allowed herself a small smile. No triumph, no gloating. Just a quiet confidence that some things are worth standing up for, even when you say nothing at all. And as the last echoes of her footsteps faded down the gangway, the full weight of her silent witness remained in the cabin, and in the hearts of everyone who had watched. The terminal's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Clara Whitman stepped off the jet bridge and into the cool evening air of Boston Logan. Around her, the muted chatter of fellow passengers carried on, some heading for baggage claim, others looking around in stunned silence. An elderly man paused beside the carousel, pulled down one earbud, and turned to his companion. "You know, she didn't need to shout," he said, voice soft but firm. "She just had to sit there, and we all saw the truth." His friend nodded, eyes fixed on the closed cabin door behind them. Clara caught the tail end of their exchange and offered a small, acknowledging smile. It wasn't the celebration she'd imagined. No cheering crowds, no confetti, but it felt infinitely more powerful. Inside FAA headquarters that night, memos were flying. Within 24 hours, the agency published a new regulation, officially dubbed the Clara Clause, mandating a two-step verification process for any passenger under 18 challenged about seat assignments or ticket validity. The language was precise. No flight crew member shall remove or relocate a minor passenger without electronic confirmation of boarding data and supervisory approval. On social media, the first short clips surfaced under the hashtag #SheDidNothingWrong. View counts skyrocketed into the millions within hours. Comments poured in. Admiration for Clara's composure, outrage at the crew's presumption, gratitude from parents grateful their children might be safer in the skies. Clara scrolled through a handful of messages, hundreds of thank you notes, a handful of skeptical remarks about privilege, and dozens of memes celebrating quiet strength. At home in Arlington, Clara's mother, Dr. Elise Whitman, watched the news coverage from her living room. She sipped chamomile tea, pride mingling with relief. When Clara walked through the door, clutching her backpack, Dr. Whitman rose and set her cup aside. No speeches, only a warm embrace. "You were perfect," she whispered. Clara exhaled, leaning into her mother's shoulder. "I just did my job," she replied softly. And in that moment, she knew justice didn't need raised voices. Sometimes, all it took was unwavering stillness and the courage to let the silence speak for itself.